Let's do it.
Okay, hello. This is episode 40 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. That's right, the big 40, as far as I can tell.
I should have dressed up.
I
These
think you did.
officially as old as I am.
Oh, right. All right, so today, what we're going to do is go through feedback we got on the first product. So the second product, we're still waiting on really just the media. Right? I think we've got drafts of the hits we'd like to post. We just need the corresponding media. And last time we talked about making that media cohere, right? That essentially, trying to work it such that ideally, perhaps we have a brief clip of 10 seconds that shows a particular kind of interaction, and then maybe build the other media from that. Potentially the audio clip would just be that, but without with the audio extracted.
Yeah.
A still from that could serve as the image, and then a textual description of the scene. Excuse me. And that would give a certain kind of coherence across the media formats.
Yeah.
So I think we're just waiting on that, and then probably the next step with that will be I'll talk to probably Amy Evans from our IRB and say, here's what we've got. It's always useful to sort of talk to IRB before submitting your materials, because they can certainly point out what you need to do before going into it and potentially wasting time or whatever. So that'll be the next step for that, but that gives us an opportunity to turn to our first product and folding in comments. We've gotten a lot of great comments on it, and then we've also gotten comments essentially through the publisher about it. Right? So that's pretty much what we wanted to take a look at today. Am I skipping over anything there?
No, that sounds dynamite.
It does. It does sound dynamite. So I think we were going to start by just talking about the feedback we got essentially through the publisher, because that's more synthesized, as it were. We got different things, and as is always the case, it's sort of an act of threading the needle in terms of how do we balance different recommendations. But I mean, that's exactly what we asked for. I mean, that's exactly what we wanted, right? I mean, that's why we're doing this, is because it opens it up to a kind of distributed feedback. So we're glad to. I mean, we were recording that, and we're glad to get it.
Yeah,
I thought all the comments were super helpful. I mean, super productive about these are revisions you probably should make. And when I read through them, I was like, yeah. I mean,
no. And the other sort of threading the needle too, it was getting the feedback on it was a reminder of the ways in which we had originally thought about sort of one thing, like one product, and then we saw how it was going to be three.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the first one the one that was out, there was a lot of the theoretical stuff, the history stuff that we were pushing off onto the third one, because we saw them as three discrete projects. And I think some of the feedback we got is some of that we need to sort of put back in, at least to the introduction, mm-hmm. to kind of set it up. So that was kind of interesting too. In part, the other threading of the needle is given that we see this as the project itself is going to be distributed across sort of discrete articles. Mm-hmm. How do we then write them so that there's only so much you can get away with? Stay tuned for the third one.
Right.
That we may need to front load some of that. So that was also interesting in terms of how the scope of this project has changed too, in terms of how we saw each individual part of it working as part of a whole. But when someone looks at the first product, they're just looking at it in more or less isolation, and it needs to do different things for an audience, I think, than it was doing for us, I guess, for the project.
Right. Yeah, exactly. that one of the sort of main comments was, precisely that was, I'm not familiar with the subject matter,
Yeah.
and you're not doing enough to clarify what it is, which is exactly true. Because as you say, it's kind of it's interesting in terms of like how you're framing that product, because if the product is an extension of the larger project, then it assumes background knowledge. It assumes that people have seen 39 videos, right? And read the, what's that?
Shock to me that they were clearly hadn't watched
Right.
40 hours of video content as part of their reading of this article.
Yeah, and gone through, I mean, there have, at different times and even currently, there have been things like overview documents, right? That do some of that labor about, well, here's what it is and why it's valuable, but not all of that made it into that product. So when you come to that product cold, it's like, it's not doing enough to say, oh, right, here's what this is and why you should care. I mean, it's a 100% accurate comment. And as you say, I mean, I think part of the impetus of the product was not to open the top on some of those broader issues and thereby kind of overwhelm what it's doing, right? Because I mean, if we want to really dig into the socio-historical issues and the potential theoretical complexities, it's like, well, then that paper becomes too big and unwieldy.
Yeah.
But what we do need to do is give enough lead up about, and I think the comments were really savvy about this, about, just the basics of, but what is this thing and why is it relevant? Why should we care? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think we kind of, I guess, right, sort of accidentally pushed off the why should we care onto the kind of historical, theoretical kind of stuff. Because what we really saw with this first one is we just want to get a hold on Mechanical Turks.
Yeah. Well, and just the text, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really interesting to, right. And at a certain extent, I don't want to use the phrase rookie mistake, but right, to a certain extent, yeah, we did all this stuff and then just assumed people would be interested in it because we had worked.
Right.
With putting like at least a previously on Mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
Well,
and so that raises a question about addressing it. So I kind of took some notes, but a lot of that, and I think a lot of those comments are potentially pertinent to like the introduction.
Yeah.
Because if we clarify in the introduction those things, a lot of some of the later comments that are sort of based on orientation, some of the later comments are like, relate to that sort of potential lack of framing. So right. it maybe speaks to the introduction itself. And so I think, part of that labor in terms of pointing out, here's what it is, here's what a hit is, right? Because a lot of comments related to, could you provide an example or, show what a hit is and discuss its parameters? It's like, oh, yes, of course we could do that, right? I mean, that's, what's that?
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we have a terse statement of, it's this kind of job post, but if you're coming to it cold, I mean, clearly the evidence showed that people were like, well, what does it do, right? So I think that's something clearly we could do. One question I sort of had for you, though, was to what degree do you think that intro, it's kind of a question of to what degree does that product stand alone? So to what degree should that intro say, do you think, this is part of a larger investigation into this thing because it is big and complex. And this first investigation is going to try and cleave pretty closely to the language of the hits and build outward. I mean, to what degree should we, sort of just lay it on the table and say, we acknowledge there are huge kind of like ethical and theoretical concerns, and potentially we're going to be moving in those directions as we go. and this first one is starting, with the language of these hits. I mean, do you think that kind of positioning is valuable, or should we pretend that that doesn't exist at all and just say, this is a hit, this is the language and why you should care, and then here's an examination of it?
Well, I wonder if there's actually a way of doing what you're saying, right? That this is part of this. I mean, the benefit of the revision is by the time this revision goes out, we'll be able to pretty clearly articulate what's happening in the second one.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say, right, so for instance, there are huge ethical and theoretical concerns. Well, ethical concerns is sort of what we're getting at in product 2, right? At least how the Turker interfaces with it. So we can kind of say that in many ways, right, this first piece is looking at the language of mechanical Turks, because as rhetoricians, that's kind of our primary, we want to start with that.
Right.
While we're doing that, we recognize this raises a whole host of ethical and theoretical concerns. This is a longer term project. That the second piece will take up those ethical concerns as we build on the first piece in interacting more directly with mechanical Turks by thinking through issues of readability, which is a function of language, and right, and then that will build out towards a theoretical piece. So what's interesting, right, is in many ways the caveat language you used essentially is also an outline for the whole project.
Right.
Is we're moving from the discursive to the ethical to the theoretical. This first piece is just looking at the discursive. I mean, we will make mention of the ethical, and right, we have that language already, right? We can, and in many ways, it's somewhat in the introduction already. We can potentially just build it out. But essentially, the caveats that you mentioned are the ways we can then place it in a longer term project. I mean, we might even in that first piece want to include some of the language that we've included about the nature of the project itself, right? That this article was written online. It was discussed in videos, right? So, we can even.
Well, yeah, definitely. I think that's something, because that's one of the comments was sort of like integration of the videos. And I think some of that was had to do with, I mean, it's going to have to explicitly, take on. So here's what, and in fact, I mean, I think one thing the introduction could do, and this comes out of, I think it was Kathleen's comments, which I think I can say because they're the names are on the,
yeah,
there isn't anonymity on the posts themselves. And there were a couple of comments where it was sort of like, is there sympathy between what you're studying and the way you're studying it? And I'm like, yes, that's precisely correct. That in a sense, the project is itself a form of Turk-like labor, right? That, I mean, what's going on in that first product is in I think certain ways, a kind of collaboration wherein the text mining operations are doing what it is that they do, and they have particular kind of choices embedded in them, to be sure. And then we are, as humans, doing things like recognizing salience, right? So I mean, that kind of came up in discussions of methods and results. Ways in which we as humans are still doing things like imposing salience. So when we look at the text mining output, there's still a degree to which, we are saying this is worthy of examination. I mean, the readability thread is a good example. It's like, what drives us to select that? And to an extent, there's a certain amount of human-based, that's what we saw as salient,
Right.
I mean, I think I think that addresses that potentially addresses that comment of, how this thing was produced speaks to, it is itself a similar kind of labor. It
Yeah.
is a blending of something machines are doing, both, this process we're going through, but also how we're looking at this subject matter of, human and non-human collaboration. I mean, I
Yeah.
definitely think, and I think some of the commenters wanted that. I mean, because some of them commented on things like stylistic concerns of, not being colloquial, but being a little, I think, more open about what's going on, which would give them sort of a bead in terms of how to read it.
Yeah. No, I was just looking back through the comments. This was Danielle DeVos's comments.
Uh-huh.
Pretty interesting in that regard. There's one, I think this is on the introduction, where she's got this, right? I mean, acknowledges, I'm wondering if at this point, this introduction is doing multiple complex things that merit additional sections. It's
Right.
like, yeah. And in fact, in our mind, that we didn't articulate well enough is those additional sections are actually additional articles that we plan to write. I mean, in that sense, right, that she's really plugged in, but even then goes on to sort of, right, I think even uses the language of like, I need more of a hook, right? There's this sense from her that it's very energizing, right? Because there's some excitement, but the excitement comes with, but I'm not quite hooked yet. Like there's sense from the readers that, okay, there's something here. Could you come out more strong about what that something is?
Yeah.
So I think even the not caginess, because she even points out, right, I may edit this annotation, right? Because she's trying to articulate that sense of, I think there's something here, but there's not quite a discernible hook yet, because in the introduction, we're trying to address all of those things, but maybe even if the introduction sort of slowed down a bit too.
Well, and I think maybe that's two, at least I have it teased out as two different things. I mean, one of them is just straight up, if you haven't heard of M. Turk before, why should I care? I mean, it's like, why is this relevant to see? And I think Jeff maybe pointed out there are a few different answers to that. I mean, one is just like, point to something like a financial impact. Like, it's like, well, this is a big thing. I mean, it's Amazon, right? I mean, it's like, point to Amazon has its fingers in a lot of these things, and this is an extension of that. And, maybe if we're not aware of it, you can just frame it as, well, yes, but it's part of this big relevant monster. He said, another potential answer to something like that has to do maybe with the humanities as a project. It's like, there are ways to answer, why should I care about Mechanical Turks, right? And there's potentially a separate framing of because I mean, I can imagine a paper that's like that isn't composed the way ours is composed, right? There's an answer for why should I care about Mechanical Turks that has nothing to do with how we compose this paper, right? Do you know what I mean? And so, I mean, potentially a secondary thing, but probably something that should go like in an introduction or in as Danielle suggests, like an in-between section there, or maybe even part of the methods is, here's what this is, here's how we wrote it and why.
Yeah, I wonder if that's part of if the method because right now the method sections is focused exclusively on the way we interacted with M. Turk, but it could be that the method section should also be the method by which we wrote this.
Yeah, I mean,
here's the project that and here's the larger project that it's a part of. Yeah, that's interesting, right? That's the way we're writing it is also method.
I mean, I think maybe that method, because right now, really what the methods is, really, it's a discussion of data collection, because that was another thing that popped out and we did this consciously, and it actually says in our methods section, so the following results section actually includes some methods discussion, because we're essentially dealing with these three separate operations, and it was cumbersome to, in the methods, say, So for the first one, this is what we did. And then in the second one, here's what we did. And then in the third one, here's what we did. And then say, okay, now look at the results. And the results is going to do, okay, remember what I talked about previously. Here's the first. But I mean, the comments were, no, really, you should separate those things. You should be saying in the methods section, here's what you're doing in your operations. And the results really should just be results.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I mean, I'll take that comment. I mean, there's a, we explicitly set that up because that was cumbersome. But I mean, if I'm willing to see that as a valuable comment, right? But potentially that methods section also should entail, because I mean, what does methods do? It explicates how this was made and why, right? So potentially this, you know, for that material in the methods, there should be maybe some of this discussion of how this paper was produced and the orientation that came from it. I mean, I think that might be a place to discuss something like, we see this as potentially a form of synthesis of human and non-human, similar to our subject matter. It's why we're doing this stuff. Is, you know, we're running operations that are things a machine does, and then we are, in a sense, saying we're skimming it and saying this is what is relevant, and so it replicates the thing that we're saying. I mean, maybe that's methodological discussion, right? I mean, maybe that intro is setting up, you know, here's what Mechanical Turks is, and here's why you should care. And I mean, maybe an answer to that is something like, because Amazon is creeping into it, man. I mean, it's like,
well, and that could be where we bring in. I mean, I'm also thinking too about the ways in which that the project's been informed, right? That in part that could be where we bring in, or not, or whatever. But anyway, right? That's part of what we talked about with Kaggle. And then there's also, so those kind of, in many ways, right? That's part of the ethical concern, right? Amazon is organizing this kind of labor.
Right.
And the other reason you should care is there are theoretical implications for this too, that get us into the kinds of things we talked about with Casey.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason that we didn't get into that is, right, we didn't want to get into it.
Yeah, because it's like, yeah, it's like pulling the thread on a sweater, you know?
I introduced Mechanical Turks at the same time we have to introduce cultural techniques. And it was just like, that's a big ask, but that could be some things that we do in this method section. And it also reminds me of the kind of thing Latour writes about what writing means for sociology, right? That the writing is where you're not writing up like sociologists don't use writing to write up their experiments, that the writing is the experiment. So Latour is that the way that he treats writing as that writing is where the experiment is taking place. So we could use that kind of language, right? That our writing of this, the discussions that we did, right? That's part of our, right? In many ways, I think there's a way in which someone could see this, and we've kind of even treated it, right? Like this product, I mean, we're even using product, right? This is somehow an outcome of what we've done.
Yeah.
But in many ways, it's just another thing we're doing.
Right. Yeah.
Product. It's still part, we're still in it, right? We've not finished the process and we now have a product. This product is just, it's, in many ways, right, that it's not a product in that sense, right? It's not like we did a thing and now we've written it up. That actually, no, the experiment is still continuing through another, right now our method has switched from video discussion, online forums, data collection, and now article writing. But the article writing isn't like out of step with those. It's in line with those.
Yeah. Yeah.
All to say that I think you're right, that I think our method section needs to account for more than just the data collection stuff. It also needs to, I think, include, And I think that will then also help people get a sense of what we're doing and why it's important, and also why we're covering this right now as opposed to other things later, right? So if we build that into the methods section, then it's very clear that, well, we're not there yet because we're still in the process of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of a question I had is it appropriate to, signpost that earlier, or is that the work something like the conclusion does, right? Because I mean, in some sense, a conclusion often is where you say, given what's been found here are the next steps. And in fact, currently it does that, right? I mean, that's how it ends. It just tersely says, it identifies we've identified some of those terms here, and we're going to move on to, let me just straight up pull it up. We're going to move on to the next step in this, right? So let me, I'm just going to share my screen with you really quick here. Yeah, so I mean, it has this terse statement. The next stage of this research project is to produce a subsequent study that addresses this aspect, and it's talking about how Turkers engage Turk, right? I mean, that's kind of what it's, and that's another. I mean, this is a thing to discuss, but if it's fair to characterize what the second product is focusing on ethics, because I wonder if that sets up an expectation that maybe that second product isn't necessarily doing. I don't know if that second product is, arguing for an ethical framework or why Mechanical Turks is evil. Do you know what I mean?
That's also something we could do by, I think giving a much more sophisticated understanding of what ethics is, right? It's ethical insofar as they all are, because they're all about relations.
Yeah.
The idea of, when you use a term like ethical, still even within the field, there's a notion you're going to come up with some evaluative criteria. Whereas I think what we mean is we're more directly interacting in a relationship with Turkers. So in that sense, I think that's what marks it as ethical, not that it's evaluative, but in a sense in which we're always interacting with Mechanical Turks, but in the second one, there's more of a direct engagement. But I see what you mean, right? There is the expectation that if that's how we describe it, then
people are maybe expecting a judgment.
Yes.
Or expecting, tell me why what it's doing is good or evil. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, as you say, I mean, it's like if we're not framing ethics in terms of a sort of qualitative judgment, but as a examination of relationships by among humans and non-humans, right? How Turkers of all stripes, both those who are workers, Turkers, but then also authors, right? I mean, how Turkers understood large are potentially interacting with the platform. But anyway, sorry.
You could mark it as the first piece is we were sort of interested in the discursive features of hits.
Right.
And the second one, we're interested in
interactions, essentially.
The relations that generate those hits.
Yeah.
That strikes me as that's the ethical framework. We're interested in the relations we were sounding out with our discursive engagement in the first piece. So we could even use that language, right? Just swap out. Right. The study will which is kind of right. We will also attempt to analyze the rhetorical aspects of hits by examining the connection between the composition and effects. I even wondered too, partially is there's that tension between the sentence above that says a subsequent study will participate in MTurk directly. How much of the second one is actually, we are doing some analytical work, but there's also a sense in which it's well, I don't want to say that, a lot less analytical, but the second one's much more a practice of Turks as opposed to a kind of analysis of, but anyway, but yeah, it all to say that we may need to do some of the stuff we have in this final paragraph. I wonder even this is the kind of stuff that could be in that method section, right? I mean, because we even talk about this shift in research topic invites a commensurate change in methods,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that was kind of a question is, should this be signposted? I mean, there's a sense in which this is written where you come to the end and it's like, okay, we've done this. Now we're moving on to this. Whereas in fact, it's like, I don't know, there's a sense which is a little duplicitous. It's like, well, we know where this is. We already know where this is going. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not like, although it is, I'd say it is the case that it's like, because I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen until we did the stuff, right? And then
Yeah.
when we did the stuff, we were like, you know, there are these interesting threads. Readability is a central one, but we didn't know that going in this. In that sense, this is not sort of the typical humanities pose of I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, partially when you write these when you write like humanities papers, it's not like there's an experiment. You sit down and you know where this is going. Whereas in other kinds of work, you don't know what the outcome of the thing you're doing is going to be until you do it.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if this kind of stuff should be signposted earlier in terms of, yeah, it's like just straight up. We see this as the first in 3 moves. I mean, you know, and say that earlier. I didn't know if that should be signposted there.
Yeah.
Or if it's, you know, or if it's until the end where you say, okay, now we've examined the language and found this thing like readability. Our next step is to examine interaction. I mean, because, you know, you can kind of conceive this as looking at the language, looking at interactions with the hits, and then potentially broadening that to things like how it's theorizing the human, right? And I didn't know if, you know, that comes in the conclusion where you say, okay, so then given what we found, here's the next step as we work toward this sort of broader thing.
Yeah.
Or if that should be signaled earlier. I mean, I literally don't know.
Well, I mean, that could be part of I mean, it could be interesting that we actually answer the so what question by describing our arrival at the answer for us. Right? That we started with an inkling of here's why we think it matters. And then we did this thing and it raised these questions for us. I mean, so that could be the way in which we build in that stuff that's in the conclusion into the introduction as both helping to frame the larger project, but to also I think maybe it answers that so what question, right? That we started with an investigation into the language of hits, and then, or again, right, whether where it goes maybe is we can put a pin in that, right? Because it could also be in the method section that movement from language to relations to, yeah, I lost the thread of that. But I think there's a case to be made for putting that in the introduction.
Okay.
Because right, this is not an Agatha Christie story.
Yeah,
right? The introduction should spoil the whole thing.
That's a good point. That's a good point, right? That it's not as though this is a chronological narrative of here's where we are. It's like, well, no, but we've done the work. We know how this ends.
Surprise, it's relations. Like, no, they can put that in the introduction. Here's and the introduction, I think, I don't know, it's introduction versus methods. In many ways, right, that's in part the rub is because this project is sort of, I mean, like anything, but much more explicitly so, is sort of methods all the way down, right? There's not much we
Right.
couldn't talk about that isn't in some sense something that we've already described in terms of method, right? That this is method, right? That we're looking at, in many ways, we're interested in Turks itself as a method that generates tasks, that generates relations, and that generates theoretical concepts.
Well, so I mean, in the current introduction, there is a, just sort of a terse statement, essentially, thesis statement of, here's what it found and here's what it didn't, right? I mean, like, so here in the introduction, it says the study's findings suggest that hits depict humans as sophisticated receptors for sensory data and emotional resonance with keen judgment about social constructions, yet hard distinctions between humans and non-humans are somewhat elusive. I mean, I wonder if some of that stuff in the conclusion would make sense in this area where, if what we say, here's what we found, then you can also say what this clarifies is the need for subsequent, subsequent study in this and this to clarify these things. I mean, just.
And that could be the so what. Right? The so what is two parts. The so what is here's what we learned. So in many ways, that thing in the conclusion, this human is keenly, right? That's the so what. In part, you should care about this because what we learned is, but what we could also say is then the so what is that this then opened up further questions. Yeah. So the so what is both the so what for this piece, but also the so what for the arc of the whole project.
Yeah, although I'd still like an answer that doesn't appeal to itself in terms of, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think at straight up at the beginning where we're saying, okay, here's what Amazon's Mechanical Turk is. I think there's a way to answer a so what question in terms of, if someone asks, yeah, but why are you looking at that, right? And I do want an answer that's not, well, because it led me to more questions about it, because that's sort of, that's a turtles all the way down where it's like, it's still appealing to what we're doing, where it's like, I mean, I think there's a different answer that's like, well, why are you looking at that? It's like, well, because it's this giant business that is part of Amazon, which is giant. I mean, straight up point to things like how much money is being changed on something like Mechanical Turks and say, here's why this is relevant. Like, it's a big thing. It's part of this big entity, and it raises these larger questions of labor and epistemology, and
that could be great. And that could be too what, I mean, I'm now just thinking about how to compose it, right? That would then lead us into, right? So the so what question is, well, this $1 billion company has
billion?
That was so naive. Oh, $1 billion here. Oh, honey. Right. Has a service that has a thing called human intelligence tasks. I mean, that means, so how does this $1 trillion organization, what does it think human intelligence and task are, right? So that gets us at human intelligence and tasks. So that, right, that's labor, that's, right, those are all kind of interest to rhetorical scholars. So anyway, that sort of, all right, how is Amazon, I mean, that's our question, right? How does Amazon, and then we could do all that work, right? This giant, hyper visible organization that
I mean, it already has questions of labor swirling around it, right? Yeah. I mean, excuse me. If you want a pithy vignette to start this off with, it's like point to something like how they recently offered to help with vaccine distribution. I mean, they're basically assuming a governmental role, And yet their own labor response to that, like, their own workers in warehouses have been getting sick. I mean, it's like, it's this big company that already has labor issues. And sure enough, they run their own labor market.
Yeah.
Neon sign. Why should I care about this? Because this thing that is a de facto government organ that already has big labor questions is running a labor market that is predicated on text.
Yeah. Yeah. where human intelligence is the driving feature of it.
Yeah, I mean, and so I think that's what some of the comments, like, I think Jess were like, look, there are lots of ways you could frame a so what, but you need one of them, right? I mean, it's like we've said, here's what we're looking at, but we haven't said, here's why you should care about this. And I mean, if the facts are, a lot of our reviewers are like, I'm not even familiar with this. Like, I didn't even know this existed until you brought it up, so you can't assume familiarity with this. It's like, well, yeah, then we have to show, here's what this is.
Yeah. How is a huge company operating as a de facto government organizing largely discursive tasks that it defines as human and intelligent?
Yeah. I mean,
unpack that. And that's what we're doing. We're going to unpack it, explore it, and then figure out how to understand what it's doing historically and theoretically.
And so I think if we do that, we can bracket at that beginning and say, clearly, this is a bigger issue than we can get our arms around. So what we're doing as rhetoricians is looking at the text of hits. And that gives us an entryway for the example to say, this is what a hit is, right? This is what a hit is. And as rhetoricians, that's why we're looking at this, because this whole thing is predicated on language, right?
Yeah. And that could be a way too that we also then stratify it, right? That rhetoric is many things, right? So right now we're doing rhetoric as an interest in discourse. Mm-hmm. We're off the second piece, which is rhetoric as is interested in relations. And the third one, rhetoric insofar as it's interested in the generation of concepts that then feed forward into discursive practice and relational practices.
Yeah.
Anyways, right, theoretical piece moves in both directions, right? So in many ways, by the time we get to the third one, here is the theoretical practice that's driving the discursive and relational practice that we just looked at.
Yeah. I mean, let me just show you this. God bless. I mean, again, it's like I'm leading you down the path here. Wait, let me actually just show that so it's a little easier to.
So, by the way, I just did finish reading. I noticed the Easterling, the book link that's out. Her book, Medium Design, is really interesting. Probably not for this piece, but anyway, it's very interesting the way that she looks at networks and stuff. So
the Easterling thing, I mean, not to get sidetracked, but there's so one of the things that's in the introduction is it says, and see, this is kind of how we answer the so what, but it's a soft answer, which is other fields have studied this, but rhetoric hasn't, right? And that's evidence, but I don't think that's enough to hang an answer to so what on, right? I mean, if someone says, why should I look at Mechanical Turk? And you say, well, other people are doing it, right? It's like, that's not, it's not a great answer, right?
Our so what answer can't be, we also need to pee on this fire hydrant.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's like that's part of the answer. I think it's relevant and I think it should be in the introduction, but it shouldn't be the crux of the introduction. But I think, sorry, what?
It should be more like, not that everyone else is studying it, so we should, but it could be more a stronger answer, which is insofar as rhetoric is a discipline that's simultaneously interested in language and relations, we probably have something unique to offer the conversation because we can synthesize a variety of methods.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's a great way of doing that. It's like, this is the discourse. We have something to contribute here, i.e. we're going to start by looking at the language of hits, which nobody has done, seemingly, at least not from a rhetorical perspective. And I don't think at all. I
Yeah.
mean, mostly what they're doing is looking at things like demographics and
Right.
and labor issues, but not, you know, labor issues in terms of like, you know, who's doing these jobs, are they being exploited, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, yes, there's a contextualization there of what the discourse to which we're contributing, but there is also in our intro, and I knew this was soft because there's a point at which we're saying it's good to look at the language because it's concrete. And currently, even in materialist rhetoric, there's a certain preciousness. It's the point in the introduction where we're saying we still kind of frame things in terms of humans are kind of special, precious things because they can do intellectual or emotional labor that's magical, right? And so there's a point in the introduction where we say, you know, still even in our own discipline, we kind of have that humanist holdover, right? And really, it's kind of a soft statement. And, you know, we kind of knew. In fact, I think there used to be a parenthetical next to that statement in the draft that was like, this is soft. And I think our fix was mostly just to delete it rather than to address it. And sure enough, you know, one of the comments is like, this is kind of soft. It's like, you know, if this is the case, point to stronger stuff. And the more I look at it, it's like, it's a little bit of a straw man to say, yeah. Well, and in the discipline, we still kind of have this sort of precious notion of what a human being is, that it does this sort of, oh, machines aren't us because we can do X, you know. It's like, I think that's probably the case, but it's a little bit of a strong man just to say that and not to point to pretty concrete evidence of, well, look what this person is doing, right? And it's also, if you frame it that way, it's pejorative, where it's like you're pointing to fellow scholarship to say what they're doing is wrong. And if you want to do that, it's like you better have stronger support than to just sort of coarsely say, oh, yeah, the field does this, you know? So the Easterling was in there because that no, you're not piece, I think what it's doing is it's not an example of someone who's still is carving out a special space for a human. That piece is saying we shouldn't be doing that. I mean, you know, that piece starts with, there's that sort of great quotation of it where it says, it talks about totalizing narratives in the first paragraph and says humans even make the mistake of thinking that this restrictive habit of mind is a gift that sets them above the rest. And I'm like, yes, right? I mean, that move of humans are special and precious isn't a great move. I mean, to me, the Easterling piece is coming at it from a different thing and saying we are in agreement with a position of like Easterlings.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's saying this special province carve out for humanity is troubling. Well, it has consequence. It has effects, right?
Yeah. Well, and what's pretty interesting about her piece, right, is that it's very much right. She's not just making a kind of, I mean, she's making more of an explicitly political statement as opposed to a philosophical one, in the sense that, right, it's that because we make this mistake, we're really bad at political activity. I mean, that's the consequence, right? I mean, that's why I think that's why that Easterling piece in particular speaks to me in terms of rhetoric, right? That her point is this being transfixed by this leaves us ill prepared to respond to particular kinds of political challenges.
Yeah.
It's not like it's wrong. She doesn't really say like it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's a missed opportunity to be being transfixed on this, because that's what she focuses on, right? It's not that it's wrong. It's that humans are transfixed.
Uh-huh.
If they could be less fixed on this, they would have a different activist repertoire, which is language she uses in other places, right? So it's not like, as you like to point out too, right? It's not about whether or not this is right or wrong. It's what does it help you or not help you notice, or what kinds of practices does it generate?
Yeah. So I mean, what I was, that might be, I mean, this is a more fine grained thing, because that's just sort of like potentially also that element could just be omitted. I mean, reading that introduction again, I was like, I wonder if we can just cut this also, if there's no need to make this. But anyway, we'll need to fix that one way or another.
Yeah.
And I was like, one way would be either to have sort of a more concrete statement of places in the discipline recently where we're still attached to the, sort of a special notion of humanity, or I was seeing it as a move kind of akin to Easterlings, maybe, where it's like, I'm not blaming anybody for anything. It's just there are effects for our approaches, right?
I think that's better because, yeah, I mean, it also avoids a move, right? We don't want to frame our work as somehow corrective, right? Because if we do that, then we've got to name names.
Right. Yes.
But I also don't think it's probably a good idea to frame it as a corrective, because in part, right, this goes back to the earlier question, which is why mechanical Turks? Well, we think rhetoric has something to offer.
Yes. Yep.
Less about we're studying mechanical Turks to fix something about our field.
Right.
More, we think there's something about the methods and practices of rhetoric that offer something to this conversation.
Yes.
And that way we don't need to do the preciousness in our field, because our so what is rhetoric has some shit to say about this.
Yes.
We're here to fix the discipline of rhetoric by our data mining of hits.
Yeah. No, I think that's because currently the introduction, I think you're exactly right. Because currently the introduction does take that kind of pose where it's saying, we should be zooming down to this more kind of concrete level. But you're right. I mean, it's like, but that's not really, that approach may not be really appropriate in different ways. So, I mean, the fix for here might be cutting that out and reflowing around it, where it's like, nah, we're not correcting a flaw in the field. What we're doing is coming from the perspective of rhetoric and looking at the language and contributing to this broader cross-disciplinary discourse.
Yeah, and that broader cross-disciplinary discourse is important because Amazon is a giant behemoth.
Yes.
Essentially organizing labor, definitions of key terms, right? I mean, think about how big Amazon is, and essentially the work, and this is what we'll get at particularly in the third piece, but essentially we should know how a $1 trillion government-like transnational corporation is defining human intelligence.
Yeah, human intelligence and task, and labor.
Yeah, that's worth noting. And furthermore, we think...
And calling it mechanical Turk.
Yes. Rhetoric, with its broad set of interests, actually allows us to grapple with all of those at once, right? Because rhetoric has an implicit anthropology. It's interest in discursive intelligence. It's interested in tasks insofar as those organize labor. Rhetoric is inherently an historical discipline. So the notion that it's a callback to mechanical Turks is of interest to cultural rhetorics. So I think there's also an argument that we can make is that we're also, and this also I think nicely frames us, we're only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what rhetorical scholars could bring to bear. Mm-hmm. Right? The cultural rhetoric alone could pick up on the use of the Turk and that sort of cultural concept and how it pervades still I forget, I'm now drawing a blank on the scholar that we hope to have on later who's written about Orientalism in the context of mechanical Turks.
Right.
So we could also do that, right? We could even have almost like a footnote that says, here's our hook very clearly defined. And then we could also say, and here's some other possible hooks for other people, but make it much more generative and affirmative as opposed to identifying a gap and correcting it.
Yeah, I'm trying to jot down.
Yeah, this is gold, baby.
You need to be writing this down. Other fields have been looking at this. The scholarly discourse.
But I like this too, because I think I'm also just thinking in terms of the writing of the introduction. I think the more we're talking about this, the more I think we're realizing that some of the moves that we're thinking about now are actually nested, right? They're going to address the so what, the how we introduce the project, having a clearer hook, being able to articulate what a hit is.
Yeah.
They all work together, right? The so what question leads us directly into explaining what a hit is.
Right, yes. Well, so here's, and this is kind of, and I've been a little bit adding to this as we go. Whoops, you can tell because I'm smashing the keyboard.
That's all.
So, I mean, yes, if sort of just, brass tacks, how are we going to revise the intro? I think, yes, the start is what MTurk is and why it's important here. Now, potentially we could do something like an anecdote, right? Just recently, Amazon offered to help distribute vaccines, and yet at the same time, they've been having these issues. And we can point to actual journalism about, people have been pointing out potential hypocrisy and saying their workers, particularly like their warehouse workers, have been struggling with COVID, and it's sort of the packages need to keep moving. Particularly like during COVID, those packages need to keep moving, and so those workers are essential, but also being kind of ground up in the way that all essential workers are. So yeah. I don't know. We don't have to.
Well, it's also interesting in terms of, wasn't there early stories too about contact tracing and Amazon's either ability or inability to do it, but that broke alongside the same story that it was essentially tracking its employees to see whether or not they were threats to join unions. Like Amazon was essentially able to track and predict employees that were susceptible to unionizing. And again, right, that would link it back to labor as well. Like literally, how do you, because that also seems to be interesting in terms of tracking particular kinds of how does Amazon track people to predict particular relations they might enter into?
Yeah. And, as we've said, I don't know how deeply we want to get into this because of the fear of sidetracking.
Right.
But definitely we want to weigh into, what Mechanical Turk is and why people should care. Labor might be a pathway into that, right? This is this big company that has these particular questions about it. And sure enough, it's running its, so it has these kind of de facto governmental functions. It brushes up against these questions of labor and collectivism and identity. And sure enough, it runs its own labor market, its own explicit labor market, right?
Yeah. No, there's in addition to, as you're pointing out, right, a risk of getting sidetracked. We also don't want to, given some of the feedback that we've not, particular feedback from people within Turkers, we also don't want this to come across as a kind of expose.
Right. Yes.
Right. That we really want to, we don't want to jump to a certain extent, if we really wanted to make it an expose, it doesn't need to be this long.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, it's awful. You don't need to do data mining to come to a informed opinion about the level of pervasiveness and control that Amazon has, right? I mean, the idea too, I mean, that's also why I sometimes find the need to have an ethical pronouncement somewhat unnecessary, is I can't imagine I can't imagine an audience member reading this and going, oh yeah, now I know I'm not supposed to like
Well,
we don't need to do that.
and to an extent, that conversation is already ongoing. I don't know the utility we're adding when there's already a lot of material about sort of ethical judgment. I mean, if you Google for this, the first hits are, why Mechanical Turk is unethical, why it's a monster. And, our intent was, we intended not to take that position. We want to look at this thing as how it's operating, not get ammunition for a pre-existing feeling of why it's bad, right?
Which is sort of, that's what makes it scholarship. I mean, it's sort of,
yes.
Right, the idea, I'm going to go read some post-colonial theory to find out whether colonialism was bad. No, you read it to ascertain how it works, its pervasiveness, the way that it's currently motivating how things work. Yeah.
Well, so anyway,
yeah.
I mean, I think potentially that's an answer, but I think, we potentially can just start with, here's what, is relevant about this, right? About here's what this is. Then we can potentially move to, there's already, if we set up, here's, Amazon has its own labor market that approaches these questions of, what a human is, what intelligence is, what labor is. Other fields potentially have been looking at this, and we as rhetoricians may have something to contribute to this, right?
Yeah.
Because it's based on text, right? And then we can explain, but M-Turk is built on hits. So what is a hit? This is what a hit is, right? It's this short thing. Here's an example, and here's the parameters, right? Because it has to have certain components. And this is what spins out of it. So I mean, that's potentially a way to kind of start this.
Yeah, and we could even too just quickly point to, like, here's an example of hit, and then just a kind of litany of, and here are topics that we see in hits. And we could also point out too, right, that the way in which hits is now part of, broadly speaking, a kind of digital humanities project. So I mean, right, so also in articulating some of the ways in which, or the kinds of hits there are, we can be adding additional relevance while we're doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, not explicitly, but right. I mean, the idea that Mechanical Turks is being used by humanities scholars provides yet additional rationale for looking into how this works.
Right, yeah.
Insofar as rhetoricians might, in the course of their research, come across scholarship that's employed Mechanical Turks.
Yeah. Let me make a note there.
Right? I mean, if you're a rhetorician that's working at the intersection of rhetoric and sociology or rhetoric and psychology, this might be a thing for you already. I mean, even the some of the hits we saw that seem to be getting at political discourse.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see how this Mechanical Turks is gonna end up potentially on rhetoric's radar, with or without us. I mean, right, you could use it to, I mean, I'm thinking, right, I'm a politician and I want to do some mass, I can't think of the word now, focus groups.
Right, okay.
You know, like, I mean, imagine that our proposed hits, right? Which of these summaries is the most readable?
Mm-hmm.
Which of these slogans gets you the most excited about you know what I mean? Like, you could do like political prototyping using Mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you could see all sorts of reasons you might not want to do that because you're looking at a very select, you know, right? I mean, I'm already thinking of reasons that would be potentially bad methods, but if Mechanical Turks keeps growing.
Well, and there's definitely stuff like marketing. I mean, there's a lot of marketing stuff that's on there, you know, just in a sense, kind of like AB,
Yeah.
which makes you feel happier, this or that, you know?
Yeah. All the brand recognition stuff.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, potentially we can, I think, here point to that where it's like, you know, this is a space that looks at marketing, that looks at political speech, also looks at these questions of like GPT-3 and CAPTCHA, or, you know, machine learning. I mean, this is a machine learning space based on text. It's like, if we're not looking at this, who is? If not us, who?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's where, you know, we can make mention of the conversation we had with Sean about, you know, automated captioning and that kind of stuff, right? So there's Rhetoric's pretty significant interest in accessibility and disability. You know, that how accessible the internet ends up being is potentially a function of how hits are engaged in machine learning. I mean, there's a certain extent in which, right? I mean, thinking of sort of human, non-human partnerships. In many ways, the internet is being made accessible for humans, and that work's being done largely by non-humans
Mm-hmm.
who are being trained by humans in things like Mechanical Turks.
Yeah, I mean, I think
There's an interesting way in which these sort of, you know, bots or algorithms become intermediaries between humans. You know, I mean, I will always keep turning to Latour, but right, there's a sense in which human beings are training bots to be diplomats.
right, a machine politics.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is in the realm of the third piece. But I think we can point to, you know, here in the introduction, yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, here's what MTurk is and why it matters. Then move maybe to it's built on hits. And so what is a hit? And then maybe a discussion of, I'm just trying to think about this practically in terms of writing this, right? How is it being sequenced? So maybe stuff like, well, whatever, you can see this. You know, what MTurk is and why it's important. It's built on hits, and here's what hits are. And maybe this actually would, yeah. And this actually sort of is a subset of its utility, right? So what they're being used for is stuff like machine learning for captioning. There's marketing on there, right? Other fields have looked at this, and Rhetoric has something to contribute, and that might give us an entry road into looking at text, but then also things like, you know, ethical, relational concerns and historical concerns. I don't know. Maybe that works as a sequence. That then might push to the methods this other discussion of the project. I mean, if we see the introduction as setting up this question of why should we look at this, and ultimately we should be putting what we found here, right? I mean, you know, the thesis statement essentially.
Spoilers.
maybe that then pushes to methods how this project has unfolded, right? In order to examine this, I mean, this could go here. It could go in the introduction. I don't quite know, right? But
so there's the question of how much are we doing in the introduction?
yes.
But I also, so there's that, the practical concern of it seems like it's too much to also do that in the introduction.
Yeah.
Also, like, I actually, independent, even if it was easy to do that, I still think it should be in the methods section because it's our method.
Okay.
I think it's worth signaling that part of the method that's informing this project is not simply the data mining, but the way that we've structured this collaborative online project, right? That's particularly because that's, I mean, right, with our conversation, anyway, right, that partially what you would put in your methods section are methods that other people could pick up and use, right? That one of the benefits of a methods section is not just that you put all your cards on the table. It's you're articulating your method. So because that's part of the value of the article, right? The value of an article like this, right? This is our conversation with Scott Graham, right? Is not just the results of our method, but that other researchers might take up the method. And we've pitched the way we're doing this as a method of doing scholarship. So I think it's both true to the project, but I also think there's value in signaling that this is part of the method that we used. We talked out loud a lot and at other people, and that was happening side by side with the data mining. And then you get that the fact that our method is this collaboration.
Yes.
If we just do the method and just talk about data mining, there's the risk that collaborative nature goes away, right? That seems to be what Kathleen was pointing out too, right? She's
exactly right. I mean, she saw it in ways that I don't think we had acknowledged, that it's like, yeah, this is an enactment of what you're talking about.
Yeah. So
it's not an add-on.
No. So I think all the more reason, if we put it in the methods section, that ensures we're not treating it as an add-on. We're treating it as central to what we're doing.
Right. Yes. Acknowledge what you're doing.
Yeah. So I think putting it in an introduction makes it feel more like an add-on, but putting it in the methods section makes it, appropriately salient.
Okay, so as usual, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, a lot of threads in Duder's head.
A lot of ins, a lot of outs. But okay, so I think probably like next steps would be rewriting the introduction, right? I mean,
yeah. Do we want to put it back in a Google Doc so we can be working on it?
It's an interesting question. We can. I mean, right now, really, it's in Markdown, but I mean, you can easily put that back into the Google Doc so that it's open there. That might be a good step.
Yeah. Yeah, because we'll want to be able to keep track of what we're each adding and subtracting.
Let's see. About 13-ish. So yeah, I mean, I think that might be the next step. Is putting that in that, and then writing this. Yeah. So that's probably the next step. We need to get that media for the second thing to get rolling on IRB.
That's this. I'm opening up the studio this weekend.
Okay, great.
My
Um,
lead actor is no longer stuffy and coughing all the time. So
yeah,
I guess we could have done that, and that would have added an additional wrinkle. But
right. Boy is clearly sick. Um,
yeah, that's why I didn't want to do it. Yeah, really mean parent makes child do homework despite the fact that he's clearly very sick.
yeah, and then yes, that makes sense. I should transfer it to a Google Doc so there's no versioning problems. Um, and then we can write this. And I might put the outline. I was kind of just because, I always like these discussions, but then sometimes when you return to it, it's like you've lost the thread, right? So it's I might put that outline, and we can use or not use that outline, but I might put that just on the document so it's there.
Oh, that would be, yeah. Because I mean, what parts of the reason I'm excited about this revision and why I think the outline is, I don't want to lose the thread of that, is I think we've really nicely rethreaded the introduction, I think, in a way that is, I think, going to be really, engaging, but is also going to like efficiently respond to the feedback that we've gotten.
Yeah.
There's actually kind of one coordinated movement that we can make that's actually going to address a lot of the concerns. And I think you're right too. I mean, this comes back to like when I realize, when I'm looking at student writing and when I have to parse, is this just a student who is writing weak transitions, or they've got fine transitions, it's just a really bad introduction? Right. And I think what we're running into is that if a really solid introduction is going to answer some of the comments that we got later on in
yeah, because some of those comments are, it's like, I'm not quite sure how you got here and what this is referenced. I mean, there are a lot of comments that are just straight up. It's like, if I knew what Turks was, I think this would mean more to me.
Yeah, no, I think there's a fair number of comments are like, again, I still don't know what Turks is. Like, this sounds great, but I've got no idea what the frame of reference is.
Yes. I mean, it's clearly a failure on our part to not clarify, here's what this thing is. Yeah. I mean, it just assumed, I mean, there are comments that are just like, it's assuming a familiarity with this. It's like, yeah, it's the straight up curse of knowledge, where it's like, it's tough to remember. Oh yeah. Everyone doesn't work with, everyone hasn't examined 25,000 of these over a couple months. Yeah, that's right.
And then hasn't done all that and then watched two knuckleheads every other Friday talk about it.
Yeah. Well, and it also speaks potentially to our lack of articulation about what that text is. Is it, just another thing in the project where there's a sort of, tacit assumption that, oh yeah, we're all doing this all at the same time, so this is just sort of like another thing. And sure, it's just another episode. It's like you're jumping into an episode, into a TV series like season 6, episode 4. And of course, people are like, I don't have this preamble. I don't know what you're talking about. And it's like, oh, right. Yeah.
You don't know that this is actually the second Aunt Vivian, not the first. Yeah, because it is both. You're right. It is both those things, right? There is a sense in which this is part of our ongoing method of following Mechanical Turks. It is also, though, a standalone, discrete product. It's both those things.
Well, and we failed to account for audiences, right? Where it's like, yeah, I mean, these are audiences who are coming to this, as other audiences will come to this cold. They're not going to come to this having, participated in this. Yeah. So the comments were super helpful because it exposed assumptions we had not, we weren't consciously accounting for.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think yeah, to make this manageable, I think, yeah, good next steps. We get them that media for the second thing, but this, I will, soon just pop this up on a Google Doc, and I'll put that on the project as well. And we can go through, yeah, rewriting that.
Yeah. But no, and I think, I mean, going back to our method, I think this was a good app.
Yeah.
I mean, thinking like broadly, right? The idea of it'd be really, this is going to sound like I'm tooting our own horn, but right. I mean, imagine a novice scholar gets a revise and resubmit. What do I do with that? And I think over the last hour, we've kind of performed. Here's how you respond to a revise and resubmit.
Yeah, sorry, you froze there briefly, so I missed the start of that.
But the idea of the value of our project in and of itself, right? The idea that you imagine a junior scholar gets a revise and resubmit. What do I do with it? And we just kind of performed for an hour.
Yeah.
To revise and think about feedback. I mean, I think this was really good in that regard, helpful in that regard.
Yeah.
Right? How do you productively respond to or start responding to feedback?
Yeah, and I thought it was good. Well, and the people who responded are ones who are exceptionally savvy about this. So I think we were fortunate that we got. Yeah, I mean, it was one of those cases where we got a lot of feedback, but it was like, yeah, this is all completely on the mark. There were very few instances where I was like, it was either conflicting. I mean, there were some of course, there's some conflicts because you're talking about different people. Of course, there's some conflicts, but I mean, there were very few things that I felt like I don't know how we'd account for that. I mean, it was like it's too far outside of the scope of what we're doing.
Yeah, no, the feedback seemed geared towards here's how to make this thing better.
Large is a weakness that, that I'd overlooked, or I knew was a weakness and didn't fix it appropriately.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, they called us out for that parenthetical that we put in saying this isn't any good, and then we just fixed it by getting rid of the parenthetical that said this.
Yeah, that was. I mean, it's like we didn't do enough to shore that particular. There were a couple places where I was like, yeah, we didn't do enough to shore that.
Well, I think what makes it good feedback, which is also good, right? That I'm glad that the project is also in part going to model good feedback. Here's how you make this thing better, as opposed to here's how you'd write another thing that isn't this thing.
Right. Yeah.
Which is the sliding scale of feedback, is good. So yeah,
well, our,
is something.
And that was our, kind of goal with the project was sort of the ongoing participatory feedback, right? That, those kind of things would come up as we go. And this is a component of that.
No, I had my annual review meeting yesterday, and my chair was asking about this project. And I said, yeah, we just got to revise and resubmit. And most of the comments are up online. And she sort of was like, ooh.
Yeah.
We maybe didn't think this through. I said, luckily it's pretty productive, but yeah, it's
cutting.
Yeah, no, but when I saw through Zoom, the way she responded to that, it sort of reminded me like, oh yeah, no, this could have gone very differently, because her first response, well, that was risky.
Yeah. Well, but that's the nature of this project. We're taking on the risk. And, I think in some ways it's worked out. Yeah. I mean, as you say, it could have been much less generous.
Yeah.
I mean, that's Kathleen's book, right? I mean, generous thinking, right? That I think it's worked pretty well.
Which may not be unrelated to the fact that it's public.
Yeah.
Right. We got the feedback we got because that feedback was always going to be public and linked to the people giving it, which changes the dynamic. So, right, we are beneficiaries of in part a dynamic that we set up. So, which is not to say that we had our thumb on the scale, but it's also to say that feedback itself is part of our method or enrolled in our method, right? They were it's in that sense, right? They were reviewers, but they're also participants in ways that I think people in double-blind peer review aren't necessarily participants, right? They're more reviewers or judges. Whereas if you're a reviewer, but that review takes place through public annotations, it makes you inherently more of a collaborator, which I think all good peer review should be collaborative, but sometimes the mechanism of peer review makes that less likely.
Yeah.
So,
well, we should probably wrap up. I mean, I'm getting some internet freezes here, so
this was
yeah.
An extra meaty app.
Yeah, but useful. I mean, we needed to do it, and it's useful. So,
Gold.
What's that?
Jerry, gold.
Yeah, so I'll post that, and we can get cracking on those changes.
All right, sounds good.
All right, I will see you
Later.